Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we'll be discussing the Rambam Hilchos Erfen of Ramim, Perek Beis, Halacha Tes. The Rambam rules as follows. Ha'emer, a person who says any of the following expressions: Amdi olai, my pledge is my standing. Yeshivasi olai, my sitting. Ay mokim yeshivasi, or the place where I sit. Rachbi olai, my width. Avi olai, my thickness. Kefi olai, my circumference. These are all expressions that the Gemara explains could refer to different amounts of money that a person is donating to the Beis HaMikdash. Kol Eila Safek. These are all a question whether how much the person should give. So what do we do? And the person has to bring and satisfy his vow according to his financial status. In other words, he can't just give a minimal amount, he has to give the maximal amount until he could say, I didn't intend for more than this. So in other words, if there's a possibility that he's giving $1,000 and a possibility that it's only 100, if he's capable of giving 1,000 and he doesn't say, I didn't have that in mind, then he has to give 1,000. When there's a doubt, you have to satisfy the doubt in the most stringent way. However, if he dies, now his heirs have an obligation to give the amount because there's a lien on his property, so that they inherited the property with that lien. The heirs give the minimum that those expressions could mean. In other words, if those expressions can mean $100 or 1,000, they only have to give 100. So the Lechem Mishnah commentary on the Rambam explains what's the difference between the father and the son. The father has to give the maximum because there's a doubt. And whenever there's a doubt in these matters, you have to take the stricter side. So why do the sons, the heirs, not have to take the stricter side? And he explains that when it comes to the father, then there's a prohibition of Bal Yachel. The Torah imposes a negative commandment, a negative prohibition of profaning one's word. And since there's a principle in the Gemara, Stam Nedarim Lahachmir, that whenever you have a question about a vow, it could go one way or another. We assume that it's the more strict way because we're dealing with a prohibition of Bal Yachel. But the heirs, there's no prohibition over there. It's only a financial thing. There's a financial lien on the property. And whenever there's a question about a financial matter, we take the more lenient side of things. So a question is asked from the Gemara in Baba Basra. Gemara in Baba Basra talks about a person who is seriously ill on his deathbed, and he makes a vow that he's making all his property belong to Hegdish, belong to the Beis HaMikdash, and then miraculously he recovers. So the question is, does that vow take effect? Because on one hand you could say the person only was willing to donate all of his estate to the Beis HaMikdash because he knew he was dying. But now that he's not dying, he probably didn't have that in mind. Or perhaps, no, when a person donates to the Beis HaMikdash, he really wants to give it unconditionally. The Gemara does not come to a conclusion. It's a suffix, it's a doubt. So if it's a doubt, one would assume that you have to take the stringent side of things, and you cannot retract the vow that he's giving everything to the Beis HaMikdash. However, the Rambam in Hilchos Zechiyah Matana says that you could retract. He takes the lenient side over that. Why should he take the lenient side? There's a prohibition of Bal Yachel. So there's a sefer called Eilas Shloimei on Tractate Erfin, Kafites Amid Beis, who says as follows. He says that the prohibition of Bal Yachel applies to a person who makes a vow. They have to keep their vow. But when you declare something Hegdish, it becomes the property of the Beis HaMikdash. And now if you want to retract it, if you want to cancel it or violate it, it's a prohibition of Me'ilah. Me'ilah is equivalent to theft. What theft is for non-holy matters, Me'ilah is theft for something that's holy. But there's no Bal Yachel, there's no prohibition of retracting your vow. He argues that the retracting of a vow only applies to a person who makes a commitment to do something. But if you already made them vow and it took effect, there's no longer a prohibition of Bal Yachel if you retract it. It's just a question of Me'ilah, of a prohibition of theft of the Beis Hamikdash. That's a monetary matter. And if there's a suffix, there's a doubt, he brings a ran in the Dorim that if a person has a question of whether he has to give tzedakah or not, if something was contributed to tzedakah or not. So since it's a matter of financial matter, you take the lenient side of things. Suffix mama and lakula, doubt in monetary matters, you take the lenient side. So therefore, when it comes to Hegdish, there's no Bal Yachel. It's just a matter of finances, a matter of the monetary issue. So since there's a question about it, the Rambam takes the lenient side of it, and he doesn't have to give it to Hegdish. By contrast, in our case, where he makes a vow, and the question is, was the vow for a larger amount or a smaller amount? There you have to take the more stringent side, because Bal Yachel is a matter of prohibition, not a financial matter. The only problem with this explanation that this author himself acknowledges is that it's from one other place. It seems that even with regard to Hegdish, to making something holy, where there's a prohibition of Me'ilah, there's also a prohibition of Bal Yachel. Where do we find this? The Gemara in Nida talks about a mufr, samach leish, a 12-year-old whose vows take effect. And if you violate them, the Gemara there says there is Bal Yachel. So you see that there is Bal Yachel even by Hegdish. And then he brings other proofs that there is no Bal Yachel. So this remains a question that we'll leave for the listeners to find the answers to.